nonchalantly approaching a vehicle, talking with them, and then all of a sudden the guy says the word gun, and like something just flipped with that officer, with that Geronimo. I can't think of his last Yanez. Something just flipped with him, and that tunnel vision kicked in, and things just went terribly wrong.
Yeah, I had sympathy for that. I guess it's difficult to be trained for a situation, and I don't know if that officer had ever been involved with a shooting before. But having served in the military, I know that there was a lot of situations for which I was trained. I was a medic, so mostly that was for wounds, injuries, that sort of thing. But I saw a lot of medics who, when confronted with a situation, an accident or a soldier passing out and whatever, not reacting as they were trained the first time it happened. So if this officer is facing the situation for the first time and Philando's reaching down for something, I mean, it's sort of confusing the way it all played out. He asked for his driver's license, proof of insurance. Philando hands him the proof of insurance and probably expected to continue to have to provide his driver's license. Then the issue of the weapon came up, which he brought up. So it was a very confusing situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. You're talking about how you're talking about how some of your other medics handled high stress situations. Some cool under pressure, others, they don't get that reaction. And I mean, it happens in, I would say any job where you're under high pressure. Some people react positively, other people you get the complete opposite. And in that case, that's exactly, from at least looking at it, that's what seemed to happen. Is that he heard the word gun, and despite giving him all these commands that, hey, can I see your driver's license, things, like I said, things took an unfortunate turn.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to, specifically in this case, not trying to say that the officer wasn't guilty. I think he was guilty, personally. But I think it's pretty obvious, and I'm trying to find ways.
And I think, and I would agree with you on that. I think not like it was a malicious intent, but at least a reckless, recklessly, and it was a reckless use in that case. But what most people, I guess, don't realize, the DAs, they did their job. He was charged. They investigated. But the whole process of taking it through to trial and relying on a jury, it gets pretty shoddy after that. I've been involved in many of them. And a jury trial is probably one of the most nerve-wracking things. You can think you have the most airtight case, and especially if you're watching it from the outside and you hear all the evidence is laid out, you can really think you have an airtight case. But all it takes is one misstep by the district attorney, or there's the right type of, in the Philando Castile cases, a perfect thing, victim blaming, where they were saying, oh, he was, the THC in his blood, or he was reaching, or he was doing X, Y, and Z, and that can change the entire perception of the jury, and you can wind up with a not guilty verdict. And it'd be interesting to see if they pool the jury, and I'm very sure it will eventually come out, what made them to come out with that not guilty verdict. I'm sure some news outlet is going to get hold of one of them, and somebody will spill the beans and say, hey, this is why we said not guilty. But that jury trial, those become, I think what the stats show is that when these cases go to jury trial, they drop to about a 70% chance of a conviction. And that's actually, that's not a guarantee at that point in time.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. I mean, when I looked at it, and I watched the video a number of times, the only way that I can conceive of some reasonable doubt is if, in fact, Philando was reaching for his gun, was holding his gun when he was actually supposedly reaching for his driver's license. And there's no way to know. But in the officer's statement to his supervisor on that same video, later on in the 10-minute video that was released, he's talking about how it looked like whatever he was reaching for was bigger than his wallet, and so we don't really know. And to me, if I'm sitting on that jury, that's the way that's where I want to know exactly what his hand was on, and it can't be known. And you can't. I don't think necessarily you can trust a police officer to. I mean, that's a very emotionally charged situation. And does he know exactly what he's looking at? We don't know. So there's enough uncertainty there. I mean, I think he's guilty, but I don't know that the jury should have convicted him, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, there's
well, no,
certainly,
and that's why,
you know.
I'll agree with you. And that's the other part playing into it. Then it comes. The other thing comes down to is what are they charging him with? What is the exact verbiage of that statute? How are the instructions read to the jury? There's so many factors that play into that, and how they can come out with that conviction. And that if the layman looking at it doesn't understand why they don't convict, there's so many factors that play into it. That it can be a confusing system on how this all plays out. I mean, up until that point, I think things were done properly. You know, with the charges levied by the district attorney, you know, they had charged him. He'd been let go. Everything, you know, along those lines have been done right.
Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned is the whole context of the whole thing, right? I mean, there's the suspicion that the car was involved in a robbery. You know, they're not in a neighborhood that you might expect them, et cetera, et cetera. But then it comes down to the point where the officer created the confusion. I think we can agree on that. The officer asked for documents, and then, you know, Philando. Here's the thing I want to point out is that I hear people the last few days talking about he should have done this, he should have done that, he should have put his hands on the steering wheel or on the dash or something like that. But the burden of professionalism falls on the police officer to be able to handle that situation. People aren't expected to be or shouldn't expected to be proficient at being pulled over and questioned by the police. So the fact that Philando brought up that he had a weapon at the point that he would be reaching in that direction is perfectly logical and rational. But in that case, what should the police officer have done or done differently in that situation? What would the training tell us that he should do?
Well, I can't say what because I don't know what their training is and what their training isn't. I can just tell you that, you know, his reaction probably is, or I should say his reaction wasn't, in my opinion, wasn't the correct reaction. I've been there. I've dealt with people who have been CCW holders, and the way I've dealt with them is not the way he's dealt with them before. But, you know, at the same time, you know, it's hard to say, you know, it's like you don't want to put blame on Philando, and you also don't want to put it all on the police officer at the same time, you know, because it's that high, so although he put himself in that high-stress situation, you know, it wasn't, like, or at least I don't believe it was intentional. It was intentional. But it's such a convoluted situation that it's so hard to want to point the finger one way or the other.
Right, that's our inclination, is to find somebody to blame, to find either it was, you know, the victim's fault or the cop's fault or whatever. But yeah, I'm willing to concede, of course, that police officers are in very difficult situations. But part of the problem is that the police have that role in the first place, quite often having to prosecute crimes that shouldn't be crimes in the first place. You know, the war on drugs and what that leads to, the animosity between certain communities and the police. And so it's put in a difficult situation. But the burden of training, if the government, and they have, decided to have laws that they do, and knowing that, put the police in situations that are going to be like this, then certainly the government, if not the specific officer, but the government bears the responsibility of creating these situations where people are going to get killed.
Well, I won't. Yeah, and I will agree with you. I think that I brought that up when I ran for state assembly last year. Wisconsin, I did an interview with them, and it was actually I did an interview post after the unrest in Milwaukee, post Sylville Smith, and we kind of talked about what can we do. You know, as you know, you have the background in law enforcement. What can we do to resolve some of this stuff? And I go, well, you know, I mean, law enforcement can only do so much to resolve, you know, their issues. I mean, we can't joke around and say there's nothing, you know, we're not at fault on some of these things. We can always get better. But some of these issues, like you said, the laws, the law of the land, some of these things need to change. We need to resolve these issues, you know, whether it be the war on drugs, some of the gun laws, even some of the lesser things like sleeping on a park bench, or, you know, some of the traffic violations that are just putting people in terrible situations. And like I explained to them, you know, just you look at, you know, drug laws, that automatically puts people in an adversarial situation. You think about a traffic stop, guy has drugs on him, cop pulls him over, that's a fight or flight right there. The guy has to, decide whether or not he's going to run or if he's going to give up. And that automatically puts, a tense situation right off the bat.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's other things
that could go one way or the other.
Yeah.
Over what?
Exactly.
Over something
over a natural plant. And the fact that Philando had THC in his system, that would, I've got experience with that. That's not going to make somebody aggressive. That's going to make somebody peaceful and non-aggressive. If you look at people that drive under the influence of alcohol versus under the influence of THC, it's they're both dangerous. By no means am I saying that it's safe to drive under the influence of THC, but it's a different kind of dangerous driving. And that translates to personal behavior as well. It's just not the sort of thing that if you find somebody and think that they're under the influence of THC, that's going to make you think, oh my goodness, this person's going to be wild and out of control. It generally doesn't happen that way. But there are other issues, other political issues that contribute to the situation as well. When we were in Chicago recently, Samuel was asking me about do the projects still exist? And for those of you who aren't familiar, there are big housing projects in Chicago, the Robert Taylor homes in Cabrini Green, among others, that basically were buildings built for people that were on public assistance to live in a concentrated area. And that led to a lot of problems. And they're still, they finally closed a bunch of the projects in Chicago. I think they're all pretty much closed, and they've distributed public sector housing amongst private sector housing, which makes all the sense in the world. But those sorts of policies, they create situations where, there are going to be problems, and that can lead to law enforcement issues as well, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the major issues, especially you look at some of the bigger metropolitan areas with crime, you're looking at low income, you're looking at major job loss issues, the poverty, those are some of the major issues that contribute to crime right there alone. Milwaukee, that Beloit, Racine area, Chicago, those are prime examples of high crime areas. And a lot of that has to do with high unemployment.
And we have to be honest about human nature as well. When people are in stressful situations, it's much more difficult, or it can be much more difficult, to act in a moral, responsible way. So in those communities that have been basically victims of the government for a long, long time, specifically African Americans, but others as well, they've been put in a situation where their morals and their character are more likely to be tested, and they're more likely to be desperate because of the things that the government has done to them. Basically, they don't always see it that way. For some reason, they keep voting Democrat, which is just beyond me, because they're the primary party that has inflicted that violence on them. But the fact is that it's created a situation where people do what they have to do. And for example, once you get a conviction for marijuana and you serve time in jail for that, if you have to, then you have problems finding a job and keeping a job. You got family issues. You're trying to support a family. All these things start to break down, and people get desperate. And it's easy for people who live in downtown Madison, for example, to judge people like that, but it's not fair, it's not reasonable, because if they were in that position, they'd probably act similarly. Matt, we got to go to a break. I hope you hold on until after the break. It's going to last about 2 minutes. Thank you very much. Those of you who are watching on Facebook, if you tune in to freepeopleshow.com, you'll find the way to listen to us and hear Matt's side of the interview, so you're not just listening to me on Facebook. We'll be back in 2 minutes at the Free People Show. Thanks for listening.
Would you like to experience being one of the free people who produce their own meat and eggs?